Hello, ladies and gentlemen, how are we? Do you have a nice lunch break? Help yourself to a wrap, that's good. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're all on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and would like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and for preserving this beautiful place that's now so-called Sydney. So I wanted to introduce my friend Jim Kelly. First of all, my name's Luke O'Connor. I'm the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Manager for Support Act. And I'm really excited that you could all join us today. So far it's been a great day, and the afternoon, it's only about to get better. But my friend to my left, Jim Kelly, who's the Director of Health and Safe Design at SafeWork New South Wales. Give him a big round of applause. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Luke, but don't go anywhere because I'm going to call on you.
I'm going to sit right here.
I think the round of applause should be for Support Act. How good is this?
Thanks.
We've all heard how challenging obviously mental health is for this industry, but the steps that the industry is making, led by Support Act today, is astounding. I think it's a really good example of what we can see other industries could and should be doing moving forward.
I've got to teach you some mic technique, Jim.
You can see who's
There
the
we go.
professional around here.
There we
All
go.
right, I'll work on it here. I hate the mic. So yeah, congratulations to Support Act on a fantastic day. And I think Ziggy's little warm-up just before us, from little things, big things grow, how appropriate is that too for what we're talking about today with mental health? I'm going to touch on a little bit about us as a regulator. So we're the Work Health and Safety Regulator for New South Wales. We work with our colleagues and other regulators around the country, but we all operate within our certain jurisdictions. And mental health is a real challenge for everyone across Australia and across all industries. It's certainly not a unique challenge to this industry, but there are some unique insights and some unique challenges that this industry faces in relation to mental health in the workplace. So I'm going to touch on what are some of those challenges, what are our expectations as a regulator, the law enforcer when it comes to safety and health and safety, and what we're doing to support industries generally speaking, but particularly want to work with Support Act and the industry itself in terms of what can we do to try to tackle some of those challenges and make it a more mentally healthy workplace. We've already heard some of the numbers and statistics, so I don't want to labour on that too much, but we know the prevalence of mental health in the workplace is extremely high in the creative arts industries, generally speaking. We also know the capability of most businesses, small and medium businesses in general, is not great, and we need to do a lot of work on that space. And for the last 4 years or so, SafeWork New South Wales here in New South Wales, along with our other colleagues around the country, have really been investing time, money and effort to try and support and assist businesses to take a more proactive step to support mental health, recognising that lots of things that businesses can do, workplaces, managers and leaders, to reduce the hazards of psychological ill health in the workplace and to support their workers to perform at their best more often, which is what we want at the end of the day. So we know mental health has a significant cost. There's a big commercial driver. So if you're not already morally motivated to do the right thing for you and your workers, there's a commercial driver for business. We know the direct cost of workers' compensation is very significant, as you can see on the slide. More than 6,800 people across New South Wales have lodged workers' compensation claims, and these numbers are from 2019, prior to the pandemic, so we are anticipating the numbers to increase. There's a bit of a lag when it comes to workers' compensation data. We know they have substantial time off work when they do lodge a claim, as much as 175 days compared to the physical illness injuries as short as 44 days. So when people are off work, they aren't able to contribute to the business, to the economy, to making money, which is what we go to work for. We know the cost of claims are significant for the government, the economy, the workers' compensation scheme, and this all has a knock-on effect to anyone who's paying a workers' compensation premium. So all businesses in all organisations need to pay a premium towards workers' compensation, and whilst they might be not directly impacted, the industry average is what impacts on the cost of the premium to that business. So the more people off in your industry is going to have a direct cost to your workers' compensation costs for the organisation. So there's some really good commercial drivers for why you need to take mental health seriously. And if you're having trouble engaging with your boss or leader, sometimes those commercial numbers can really come into play and help motivate them along the path. I wanted to really share with you this slide. This is a trend over time in terms of mental health claims, and it's really important to note that there's a lot of stigma obviously around mental health, but there's also stigma around workers' compensation as well. So we know these numbers are underrepresented, generally speaking, across all industries. Probably more so in your industry, just by the nature of the gig economy, the original gig economy you guys are. What we are seeing is that the trend is increasing. We're seeing more and more claims each and every year, so partly that's a good thing. People are finding it more comfortable. The stigma is not as bad as it has been in the past. So people are actually reaching out to their employer, lodging a claim and seeking the support and assistance they need, which is good. But we are seeing obviously the longer term cost and duration of those claims is getting more and more severe. So these are serious claims numbers. So 5 or more days off work. And unfortunately, that's a significant impact to individuals and to businesses as well. So again, the commercial driver is quite significant for both individuals, organisations and the broader economy as well. Now, as we've all spoken about, we all have good and bad days. All of us, generally speaking, will have impact on our mental health. As many as 50% of us will experience mental illness at some stage in our lives, a diagnosable condition. So if it doesn't impact on us personally, it will impact on someone very close to us. And some industries are overrepresented compared to others, and the creative arts industry tends to be one of those as well. But in saying that, everyone can benefit from a mentally healthy workplace. Like we said, we have good and bad days. We have lots of things that impact on our work performance. Some of those are outside the work control, which we recognise, but others are certainly in the control of the workplace, and the way the work is designed is a big factor in doing that. So a mentally healthy workplace is a business that takes action to prevent issues in the workplace within their control. It provides a supportive workplace, and it encourages people to take steps to look after their mental health, so the individual responsibility as well as the organisational responsibility. The support network has come through in a number of the chats we've had earlier today. I went into the parents panel just before lunch, and it was fantastic to see the panel members talk about how they support each other and how their industry or their team, or whatever team it is that they belong to, are very supportive of their parental responsibilities. And the same goes in the workplace. There's a lot of support that a workplace can provide to someone who might be having challenges both in and outside the workplace. Now, obviously, we all have work health and safety obligations under the legislation, and this is a bit of the legislative pyramid. The pyramid reflects our reasonable and practical steps to ensure health and safety. It does not call out specifically mental health, it just calls out health. And health obviously includes your physical and psychological health. There are a number of regulations that go into more detail, and they specifically provide detail around construction, for example, falls from heights and machine guarding and planting, and all these traditional health and safety hazards or risks that can kill people and cause serious injury, which is fair enough. That's traditionally where the focus has been. But what we are working on across the country now are draft regulations to tailor mental health and psychological hazards in the workplace. So that work is underway and likely to impact a number of jurisdictions in the near future. Victoria has already released their draft versions of the regulations. In New South Wales, we went down the path of a codes of practice, which is not law, but it can be used as evidence to say how you do comply with the law. And we released our first psychosocial hazards code of practice, which is really spelling out what the expectation is for all employers around how do you comply with the legislation when it comes to mental health. And if you haven't seen the document or your boss hasn't seen it, really encourage you to talk to your boss about, are we doing enough to comply with our legal obligations around mental health? It's really important. In addition to that, there's a wealth of information around guidance material and standards and things like that, but what I'm really keen to see the music industry get behind, and Support Act is playing a really lead role, is looking at industry-based standards, so tailoring the standards to meet your industry on how you can comply with the legislation, but more importantly, go beyond that to make sure you are providing a mentally healthy and safe workplace. And I think that's something we can look forward to in the very near future. Now, this is where I probably want to call on the expertise of Luke, because Luke, you know the industry better.
Come join me on the couch, Jim. This is your cue to join me on the couch.
Mike.
There we go.
There it's working. So I don't know your industry anywhere near as well as you do, Luke. So tell me, what are some of the psychological hazards that you guys would encounter?
Yeah, well, we've got a pretty epic list here behind us, but first of all, I wanted to just take us back a little bit about why it's so important. Why the presentation is missing some of these ones here, but also why it's so important that Support Act and SafeWork New South Wales have this relationship. I think, from my perspective, what we've been doing is rolling out a whole range of education and training initiatives, because what we want to be able to do as an organisation is help people understand how they can get help themselves and how they can support their colleague. It's such a diverse landscape, the music industry. You've got sole entities, artists who are working completely in silo, all the way up to major global corporations. So such a diverse area. So we're trying to do programming for that. But then, in the last year, this relationship we've had with SafeWork New South Wales. Can you just explain in a bit of briefly why you think that's such an important relationship, and what the kind of hope is for that going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. We try and do this with a lot of industries, but we don't always succeed. To have an organisation like Support Act to get behind what we're trying to achieve in terms of healthy and safe workplaces is fantastic. But more importantly for the industry, to hear it from industry leaders and people that know the hazards and the risks in the workplace, know what is reasonable, what's practical for organisations and entities, what we call PCBUs, the duty holders, the ones that have legal obligations under the law. You guys help us translate it into a language that actually means something for the industry. So that's fantastic from our perspective.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good. Well, we feel the same. It's an important piece of work, and already we are starting to engage with workplaces through our workplace wellbeing program, where it's starting to introduce music, and we're talking like small enterprises. I'm sure there's some people in this room who are running very small businesses with only a couple of staff, or even one staff, or it might even just be you as an independent manager. But what are the things you need to be doing to look after yourself better? What are the things that by law, and we're going to get to it later in the presentation, I know, what are some of the things by law that you're probably obligated to do? What are the things that Support Act and SafeWork New South Wales in this instance can help you to do? And what are you obliged to be doing for your staff as you grow as a business? Because we know that lots of businesses in music grow very fast. And just as much as OH&S rules apply for physical hazards, this is certainly an area of growth, isn't it, around limiting or minimising psychosocial hazards. But to your question, Jim, before we jump.
And it's an interesting slide because you've got everyone guessing on now what are those hazards that are missing off the slide.
So these ones here that you're missing, they're the ones that we were going to talk about. But no, that's a joke. Some of the things you might see in our industry, there's a lot of talk about the show must go on, okay, which is important. Shows have got to go ahead. But sometimes they go at great cost. So I think, and people in the audience, please feel free to sing out if you can think of anything, but long shifts, exposure to bullying and harassment is a really big thing in our industry, as was pointed out earlier through our research. Exposure to drug and alcohol use. But also, even when I looked at this list, which is kind of your generic list for across all industries, is that there's some things that in the music industry we think are very unique to us, but they aren't. Remote or isolated work, etc. These are things that are seen in other industries just as much as they are seen in ours.
Yeah, very much so. And I think high job demands is a generic term we use when people are under the pump, essentially. And bullying is often a symptom of high job demands. Yeah. Interpersonal conflict between workers, when you're under pressure, it's natural it's going to come out. When people are fatigued, when they're working long hours, they're not getting the rest breaks that they need, they're not getting the support that they need to perform at their best, it's going to come through in interpersonal conflict and bullying type behaviour in the workplace. We know when you're running a big gig, when you've got an event coming on, the time pressures are pretty significant. But you can anticipate that. You know that's going to happen. I often use the example of tax agents. They know end of financial year is going to be a busy time for them. They need to plan for that. As a regulator, we expect them to plan for those high and peak job demands. As a regulator for your industry, if you're organising the big day out, you know that's going to be a big day. You need to plan for that. You need to have the resources to manage those peak periods. And if the resources are limited for all sorts of different reasons, then you need to support those people who are under the pressure at that time to prevent some of these hazards from occurring.
Exactly. And if we just, because the industry is not just one, it's not just one thing. We've got crew, we've got artists, musicians, and music workers. And I look at something like role overload, like high workloads. Like we at Support Act do quite a lot of work with crew care. And we know through them and through our own interactions with people in the crewing industry that role overloads and kind of not understanding exactly what job demands are, particularly when you've got, the client, which might be the promoter of the festival, crewing companies, and then subcontractors, and then whoever those subcontractors might get on as sole traders to do, loading, driving trucks, etc. like that. It's not always communicated down the path what the obligations are around minimising psychosocial risk. So that's what we're really up against, particularly with something like workload.
And I think you touched on the key word there is communication. You may not work for the same entity, the same boss, but you all work collectively for the same objective of get the show on the road or get the performance to go ahead. Consultation is key, and it's something that's actually expected in the legislation that you do consult between the different parties that are organising it, whether they be sole traders or large organisations. They all need to consult together, and there's a legal obligation to do so.
Great. Maybe we move on to the next slide.
So obviously we touched on this a little bit in terms of the example of high job demands and bullying. But stress response can be prolonged, so from exposure to stress over a long period of time, or it can be from a one-off serious incident, violence in the workplace, for example. But it has multiple different effects, and that can be from obviously reduced mental health performance, so your mental health ability to perform. It can obviously cause psychological injury, whether it be from that one-off trauma exposure or from a prolonged period of exposure over time. But it also can present in physical ways as well. And a classic example in your industry would be the roadies with back injuries. When you're under high pressure and you're lifting, pushing, pulling, carrying all sorts of equipment that you need to get a gig off the ground, you're at risk of injuring your back and causing problems. But you're also at risk of the psychological or secondary psychological problems that may arise from that back injury. So they're very much interlinked.
Yeah, and I reckon what's the really interesting thing about this is it's really, let's highlight prolonged or extreme, because something like touring, you know, if you're out there touring, whether you're, I'm sure there's some TMs in the room here, you know, there is unhealthy eating goes on. There is a lot of time in the car or on the, you know, at airports or whatever it might be, and that does have an impact on, you know, how you eat, you know, how much sleep you're getting, all those kinds of things. But it's that prolonged exposure to that without a plan to mitigate it. Like I know Support Act did a documentary with Brendan Love from the Teskey Brothers, for example, and with their touring schedule, they realised that they were really burning themselves out. And Brendan Love, their bass player, actually had a serious anxiety episode that led to him having to go off tour. And what that meant was that they needed to look at their tour schedule and completely change how they do things, have separate hotel rooms, more down days, no longer just, you know, truck stops and Chico rolls. It had to be like proper meals to start looking after themselves a little better, because they, similar to what Jeff Crabtree was saying earlier, they wanted to have long careers. Like, we don't want to burn bright and then burn out. So
that's a great leadership from an artist's perspective. And I did hear the other day when we had a workshop with Support Act about how artists call the shots a lot. They set the deadlines and the timeframes and the schedule for the performances. But the artists are a legal entity when it comes to the work health and safety obligations. They do have duty and obligations, and whilst we don't heavily regulate your industry, it's a bit of a challenging one for us to regulate it.
You're going to send an inspector
Friday
and talk to
Saturday
Elton
night.
John on his next world tour or something?
If an incident goes bad, they will get called into question, and they may end up on the stand in court. So it's something that artists need to be aware of. And if you're an artist manager, then you need to make your artists aware that in order for the show to go on, you need to support the crew that support the artist. And that's
I have to remind everyone here, we're not here to scare you. Or this is not a scary thing.
Absolutely not. It's about a
Jim, you're not interested in just going out there and catching people out, are you?
No, not at all. I want to prevent the person.
This is where we're at. We're at the prevention.
Absolutely.
The prevention stage.
And to be honest, as regulators, we aren't knocking on your door looking at to see your paperwork systems, things like that. That's not what we're about. We're about preventing the injury in the first place. But what we know is that this industry is highly susceptible to serious mental illness in the workplace. And if an incident doesn't come up, or if someone comes to us as a regulator and says we need to look into this, then we have an obligation to do so. And we want to make sure you guys know what the expectation is, that you're having those effective consultations with all players in the organisation, and we're preventing it in the first place, doing everything that's reasonable.
That's right. And I think there's no escaping it either. As our research showed this morning, and what we hear also from Sally Gross this afternoon in the Can Music Make You Sick keynote at the end of the day, is that even though, you know, when you look around sometimes you can kind of put your head in the sands, it's you can't escape the fact that the stats really speak to an industry that needs to get better at looking after itself and its colleagues. So, yeah.
And it's not that hard, to be honest, Luke. So we're going to touch on a few different resources available both from Support Act and from government to help businesses do this. But it's not that hard. It really starts with leadership from the top. So looking at your leaders, whether that be the leader of the organisation, the CEO, or the people that are the event manager, the artist manager, or even the artist. These are leaders in the organisation that are running these shows. They're the ones that are most influential, and get them on board. Use the commercial drivers, use the moral obligation.
Yeah, so look, that's an interesting thing, because sure, that sounds easy on the paper, like get leadership support, like go and talk to your CEO, who's, you know, can be an intimidating character. Sorry, Clive Miller, if you're out there. But how do you have that conversation? You know, it's a tough one sometimes.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think there's four things that really motivate CEOs of organisations to take mental health seriously. One, it's the right thing to do. The pull on the heartstrings, the mental health motivations. It's generally the right thing to do.
The ethical approach.
Yeah. If they care about their people, which most people do, they're going to do the right thing by them. But if that doesn't work, you've got the commercial driver. And I touched on some of those figures at a statewide level, but they equally apply to anyone who's paying workers' compensation insurance. So from a commercial perspective, it makes good business sense to keep people healthy and safe and productive in the workplace. If they're off work for mental health or any other reason, it's going to cost the business because you've got to replace them somehow. You've got to find talent at short time frames, and that's not easy to do. So that's going to motivate a business. But if that fails, you've also got the reputational damage of a serious injury or illness in the workplace. And we're talking serious, when we're talking about mental health, we're talking about drug overdoses, we're talking about suicide potentially. 9 people per day die by suicide here in Australia, 8 male, 2 female. These are really serious implications, and if that happens at your event, that has all sorts of commercial impacts for an organisation.
Absolutely.
So we also touched on consultation. Consultation is a legal responsibility, but it's such a simple thing to do. Have a huddle on the day of your event. Have a huddle planning for those peak periods and problem solve it. I think a number of speakers earlier this morning said, if you talk to the workers, they know the answer. They know what it's going to take to manage through that peak period that you've got coming up.
I think that's a good one. I think that's one that often leaders are scared of as well. I know through the workplace wellbeing check-in program that we run, we survey people confidentially before they do the education, go through the workshop, and then again at the end. And often people aren't reporting, like sheer carnage.
Yes.
It's generally like, we want to take steps towards a healthier workplace. We want people in positions of management to know that as a workforce we're really committed to supporting one another. And then once they go through, even the process of learning more about mental health has a net benefit for mental health. So when we do the survey afterwards, all the reports we're getting is like, we feel already better just for having broached the topic. So I think if you're doing that advocacy, it's like even starting the conversation is going to do wonders for your workforce.
I went to the parents panel earlier before lunch, and I heard Fanny and Nathan talking about how simple it is if you cater for parents who are working or going to a gig. It could be as simple as having a room in the green room for your children, for example. That takes the stress off that performer, the artist or the crew that are attending that gig, so they don't have to worry about a safe place for their children if they have to go on crew. So it's simply planning ahead, consulting with your workers and listening to what the stressors are that they might be exposed to. Once you've got leadership support, once you've consulted and listened to what the hazards or risks are, then you put a plan in place. And the plan doesn't have to be overcooked. It could be as simple as a one-pager for your weekend gig that you've got coming up. Or if it's something like the Big Day Out or Fringe Festival, then you might have to plan a bit further in advance, 3-6 months in advance, and consult with all the different players that are going to be involved so that you can consider the hazards and risks and what you're going to do to try and manage those risks.
100%. All right, well, let's get into some practical stuff here. So, processes for setting standards of behaviour and reporting issues.
It sounds complicated.
It does sound very complicated. Why do you guys always have to choose such complex and alienating language for these things?
It was trying to be generic for all industries. So we're talking about behaviour in a construction site. We're talking about behaviour in an office setting. In your case, you're talking about behaviour at an entertainment venue, which obviously, to some extent, has a different level of tolerance. You're dealing with a traditional culture that has been probably have a very low threshold, a high threshold to fairly poor behaviour when it comes to drugs, alcohol, sexual harassment, bullying in the workplace, language and violence. All those kind of things are things that culturally you're struggling with and challenge. As an organisation, as a leader, you need to set a standard of what you do and don't accept. That's your code of conduct, or it's a standard that you have of behaviour for your team, and that team may include the sole traders and the subcontractors that you need to engage with and work with. That's a reasonable expectation for any organisation and for any worker. The next one is information training and supervision. We see this often with non-English speaking background or inexperienced young workers, people who aren't experienced on the job. You can't throw someone in the deep end and expect them to perform the job safely or well. So there is an expectation on the law that you will provide them with suitable information training and supervision to do that safely. It's a pretty straightforward one, really.
Okay, and this one, multiple duty holders. I know you can give the explanation because it does sound quite legally, but going back to what we were talking about leadership about before, this is where this really comes into play, isn't it?
It does, and probably a better example, because I know it probably better, you might be able to apply it in the music context, but if you look at a builder building a house, they've got a sparky, they've got a plumber, they've got a carpenter. They might all be sole traders, all trying to work together to build a house. They're all duty holders. They all have legal obligations to themselves and to others at the workplace. In your context, you've got a whole gang of crew that need to get together to run an event or to host a gig. They're all duty holders. They all have legal obligations, and they need to make sure that they're consulting with each other and following these simple steps.
Okay, I'm breaking that out as well, because like talking about leadership, it doesn't just have to be from the top. What you want to see, or what we've been talking about at Support Act especially, is like how do you empower people within organisations to be that change within their organisation? It's just not contingent upon CEOs, people on the board, people in senior positions. It can be people within the organisation that take that kind of advocacy role.
Absolute leaders, influencers, those who can have a lot of say and a lot of pull, really make a difference.
That's the kind of stuff, just a little ad break, but that's the kind of stuff that Support Act wants to do. We want to work with people who want to be equipped with all of those tools to really try and help make change within their workplaces. And we're doing it with the help and guidance of SafeWork as well.
And you'd be surprised how many times we get a phone call saying we need some influence from the regulator. Come and have a chat to our boss. It works sometimes, and that's always an option available to you if you need to go down that path.
That's the scary approach.
We don't like to do that, but it's available to you. Managing stress. Stress is good for you. We all have stress. We have good and bad days, and we need to manage our stress on any given day. But when it becomes unhealthy, when it starts to impact on how you manage your stress, and in the music industry, when you're away from your family on the road, there's lots of very accessible, unhealthy methods of managing your stress. That should be alarm bells for your colleagues, your workers, your managers, that you need to provide some support. So I think we were talking about riders a little bit earlier in the conversation before lunch, and it's one of the few industries where your rider comes with alcohol as standard practice.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be an employer by choice, is that the right way to go? Do you want to consult with the artist or the team beforehand and say, do you really want drugs or alcohol available at your venue? That's a fairly simple step you could take and give it some consideration.
Absolutely.
What help's available from Support Act, Luke, in this space? Sales plug.
Okay, you're the question. You're asking the questions now. Well, loads. So we've done so much work over the last few years. We want to support people who are pursuing creative careers, who are independent. So our On My Mind program, month to month, is an open invitation to anyone in music to come along. We cover a range of topics, not so relevant to workplace mental health and safety, but how to kind of have a healthy mindset and a healthy mind to create music, how to avoid conflict, which I guess is related to our conversation, how to manage depression, anxiety, and those kinds of things, but always with a music industry lens. As I mentioned before, our workplace wellbeing check-in program is really starting to roll out and hit its stride, and I encourage all of you to go to our website and check that program out. We've over time we've evolved it, we've tweaked it. We really wanted it to be something, because these programs exist everywhere. There's a million different companies doing workplace health and safety, but to us, the workplace is the festival site, the studio, the tour van, and the office. It's different and it's unique to us. And so we saw a gap that we needed to do something that was unique for our industry. So I encourage you to go and look at that, as well as, of course, our helpline services. We have the Support Act Wellbeing Helpline, the LGBTQI+ helpline, the First Nations helpline, and our manager support line as well. So a whole bunch of stuff that we're encouraging people from music to get involved with.
Which are great. Again, I say this industry is leading the way in some fantastic examples of how to support industry supporting industry in this space. Our resources are fantastic as well. They're generic, they're across all industries, but they're really evidence-based, they're research-based, and they're available to particularly small and medium businesses. We make our services available as much as possible to help businesses up to 200 employees. So we've got some online tools and resources, a step-by-step guide on how to create a mentally healthy workplace and put your plan in action. We've got this online pulse check, which is a bit of an assessment of where you're at in your journey on creating a mental healthy workplace. And you as a worker or as a manager can do that to try and influence your boss and get that leadership support. We've also got a couple of services that we've outsourced to some vendors of ours. So Black Dog Institute, which is very well known in the mental health arena, provide free training for managers, workers, and employers, funded by SafeWork New South Wales for businesses up to 200 employees across any industry. So actively encourage you to tap into that while it's available. It won't be available forever. And we have a new service that's been only going for about 6 months or so, which is essentially a coaching service for business leaders to help tackle the mental health challenge, whatever that might be. It's really flexible. If you've got a conflict in the workplace, if you've got a person who's disclosed a mental health issue and you want some help on how to manage it or how to deal with it, pick up the phone and our vendor, Transitioning Well, who are trained organisational psychologists, will help you through that and then also help you develop a plan to try and prevent more issues arising in the first place. So fantastic resources available to any business.
There really is, and not to throw shade on your tools, but the thing is that they are generic. and they can seem a little bit hard to interact with. But I can guarantee you that that was my first thought. But once I got in there, once you're thinking about your own business and how to apply that logic that SafeWork New South Wales have put in place, it really starts to make sense. You go, okay, well, I am seeing that. Okay, these people know what they're talking about. I'm going to get on with it. Which I guess we're going to go to Q&A now, Jim.
Yes, I think so.
No, before we do that, I just wanted to issue the challenge. I think it's one of those things that we go, it's just too hard. It's so hard. I'm just trying to run a profitable business here, or I'm just trying to get my band successful, or whatever it might be. These kinds of things are hard, but I'm here to assure you that it doesn't have to be hard. There is help out there from us and SafeWork New South Wales and many other organisations around Australia. Arts Wellbeing Collective in Melbourne are one of our partners and doing fantastic work in this area as well. And, I challenge you to go, well, this is the time actually. We're going to draw a line under it. We can take little steps towards a healthier music industry by looking at our own work and what we're doing. Ironically, people in music are often quite shy, but I would encourage you to sing out if you have a question. I'm not sure if we have a microphone. We do. We have a microphone. We have a microphone over here. We've got about 10 minutes of questions. So please.
Far away.
Hi. I have a very dry technical question about, I guess, making that leap between going into that creative practice and then having to switch into being an administrator for your own business. And I think at some point it happens to everybody out of necessity. What happens when your moving forward completely depends on a responsiveness from another organisation, and that responsiveness is, how do we say, maybe not responding.
I'll take this one if you don't mind.
Yeah, I was going to say,
I think
go for it.
that particular what you're asking there. I mean, that to me is all about communication, and I think how do we set our expectations of what that communication should be? Like, you can't do your job, you can't be the best at what you do without setting expectations for what you expect back. So you'll never reach your optimum as a subcontractor or whatever it is that is in your position, if they don't understand what your expectations are, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think consultation's key, and also self-care. As a sole trader or a leader of a very small business, you need to look after yourself and your immediate team too. So you've got to make a judgment call at the end of the day. Can you work with this business that's that partner that's not cooperating? Do you really want to work with that business if they're going to support you and your team? It's a tough call to make, particularly in tough times, but the consequences of not getting that right can be far more significant on your own personal mental health and well-being and that of your team that you have to support and lead as well.
I suppose I'm thinking of it in terms of, well, for example, somebody has one of my licenses, so I'm actively pursuing, excuse me, that's not registered properly. So to just go a bit further with that, you can allow so much time for an organisation to work their shit out before you get to the point where you need to clamp down.
That does sound like a regulator issue.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
that's the next step. So
We got there. It is a regulator issue. Yeah.
So that's what the regulator is there to do at the end of the day. So we absolutely encourage workers to raise the issue with their employers or businesses to raise it between each other when there's that consultation piece. But at the end of the day, if that can't work and they're not complying with the obligations, we as a regulator will get involved and absolutely encourage it to reach out to us or any other state regulator will do the same thing. We're all working collaboratively together to tackle this issue.
Thanks very much for your question.
Tony Moran from Crew Care.
Hello, Tony.
Hi there. You raised earlier in the piece the idea of a industry-wide set of standards, and what I hear quite regularly and was really brought to the fore during COVID was with the COVID safe plans that each gig had to provide was the differences between the states, and it is always a challenge, particularly with the Touring Act and touring businesses, with inductions at each show, which have to change according to state law. How closely do you work with other states to try and ensure there is some kind of standardisation to make life a bit easier as far as ensuring that those governances are met?
It's a great question, Tony, and it is a real challenge for any organisation that works across borders. The nature of our parliament at present and the nature of the work on safety laws is that each state is responsible for their own jurisdiction. There has been efforts over the years to try and harmonise the laws, which is a bit of a fancy word for trying to get them all to fall in line and be synced.
Get along.
And they haven't quite succeeded on that. We're reviewing our Australian strategy this year for the next 5 years or so, and they've made a refreshed commitment to continue to do so.
Do you reach out to your equal at work, Safe, and go, "Gee, this is harder than it needs to be"?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Victoria's probably not the best example because they're probably going it alone more so than most of the other states.
Right.
And there's obviously lots of politics and government involved in this, but what there is a model work health and safety legislation that's generally consistent across the country that says you must take all reasonable practicable steps to ensure the health and safety of your workers. The detail does start to vary. The COVID safe plans is a great example of where, under public health orders, each state had different rules, and that would have been a nightmare for you guys that are travelling across borders and trying to run gigs and all the rest of it. I can only imagine. But in terms of work health and safety principles, it is pretty fundamental that you have to take those reasonable practical steps, and it doesn't go into prescriptive detail. But the start of the question was about industry standards, and having a national standard that has considered all those laws and tailors it to the industry is gold. And I would actively encourage the industry to get right behind that, and I think Support Act has certainly taken that seriously.
Probably got time for one more question. Do you have any more questions? Okay. Oh, we've got one down the front here.
Thank you so much. It won't be long. I just wanted to ask you both a question. So I run a small media studio which does creative and also news articles. But I guess my question is, if when we look at the music industry as a whole, is it do you think that there's a cultural schism between, say, for example, the creative mind or the artistic mind versus viewing it as an industry, as something that can be manufactured? And do you think that that kind of prism that we view the creation of art is the reason as to why there are so many mental health issues?
Okay.
It's a really powerful question.
Great question. That's not a quick question, Dan, by the way. That's like an epic hour-long philosophical discussion. But a really good question. I think the first part of it, personally, for me, I'm now shifting my language away from talking about music industry, because as a creative, I see it as, I don't feel like I'm part of industry. I'm part of a music community. People are creating music. People are delivering music. And I know that's just splitting hairs, but that's how I feel about it. And sure, I agree with you. There are certain things you put your mind through as a creative that doesn't align necessarily with this whole idea of, psychologically well workplaces and all that kind of thing. But I think through this framework and having a focus on businesses in music and people, one of the biggest issues with the beginning of the pandemic, with people in music accessing crisis funding support, was they didn't see themselves as businesses, and they hadn't taken themselves seriously enough to go and get themselves set up. Even if you're a sole trader who's like writing songs or just doing gigs occasionally, but that's important that you take yourself seriously in that way so that you can get the support when you need. So that side of it, it can align. This is the framework within which we're approaching this particular part of our Mental Health Work at Support Act, is that it's about businesses. But I don't know if that answered your question. I don't know if you want to... got close? I think so.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot in that question as well. I think if I'm not an organisational psychologist, so I qualify my response before I say that. So talk to the psychs in the room. But I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that people of creative mind, whether it be musicians, artists, and others, are somewhat more susceptible to mental illness, generally speaking, if you looked at the odds and the stats. So that's a factor. But regardless of that, regardless of what industry or workplace you work in, when you come to work, you bring your whole person to work. So you need to support a person whether they are dealing with mental health or not, and when they have good and bad days.
And setting up optimum environment for you to flourish as well. It's all part of it. It's like, psychosocial framework or whatever you want to call it. It's just about creating that beanbag that you can, you can be your best workplace and make
That's
sure everyone doesn't get hurt while they're doing it, That brings us to the end of our session. Please, big round of applause for Jim Kelly from SafeWork New South Wales.
Thank you.